Welcome to the channel. Thank you to everyone for tuning in. Joining today, where I'll be talking to you guys about one of my favorite and my most expensive watches from my collection. This video is a bit of a follow-on from the video I did on the MM300, the SBDX017 some time ago. Now the watch we're looking at today is the Seiko SPB011, aka the MM600, which is the bigger brother of the MM300. And also, like the MM300, I didn't know this until very recently that there is a predecessor to the MM600, model reference SBDB001, just like the MM300 SBDX001. So with this review, it's basically a year on, and I'm going to waffle on a little bit about the watch and why it's so great, cover the specifications, the finishing, but also give you an insight on what it's like after a year and what negatives I've found. There's a few things about this particular watch which made me want to get it. Now, I don't have a long-standing history of being into watches, and nor did my great-great-great-grandfather hand me down an Omega or a Rolex. But once I got my legs firmly in the watch hobby, I had a collection of plenty of entry-level Seiko divers, and I just stumbled across a picture of the MM600, and wow, the feeling was of excitement and just how awesome this watch looked. It had me literally dreaming about it. And that feeling was similar to when I saw the Seiko MM300, but with the MM600, this was much further away, and to be honest, as time went on, I didn't really think I would get one. Now, it's only recently where I had exhausted a lot of Seiko options. I've gone through a large portion of the really well-known and significant Seiko watches, all mid-tier and below, and this was the only thing left, or the next step should we say, without going straight to Grand Seiko. Now, one of the main drivers was the movement. Where else or how else do you get your hands on a spring drive movement for around the $2,000 mark? On top of that, you have the most badass looking diver ever. This was a serious driver in looking at the value for money aspect. Similar point to what I made with the Seiko MM300. What from the Swiss world compares to this MM600, the looks and the movement? Nothing that comes to mind at all. So the movement is actually quite old now. Even though it took Seiko 20 years to develop a spring drive mechanism, this is the 5R66 spring drive GMT movement. And yes, it is a true GMT, as the hour hand is independent and can be moved even with a second hand still running. But I actually don't have any use for a GMT. This is what I thought, but the spring drive is still there. So before I tell you more about the movement, let's have a look at some of the awesome watches this spring drive 5R6's movement is in. You've got the SBDB029 or the SNR version. You've got the SBDB015, which is the actual Landmaster with the Unicrown. You've got the SBDB018, which is the Transocean GMT spring drive, and the Transocean being one of my other favorite watches, and the SBEJ003. Now, all of which you can agree they look super cool, and there is nothing like them on the planet at that level which looks like them. Ultimate utilitarian tool watches, and these are like the G-Wagons of their day. Now, they've put this movement, as you can see, in some of the coolest watches Seiko have produced. The movement itself is actually hand assembled in Japan. It is the equivalent of the 9R66 Grand Seiko movement, but it isn't as well decorated, as most of these were in closed case backs, and those 9R movements are in the top end GS watches. Now, the movement itself does have 30 joules, something like 276 components to make a single movement. The accuracy is phenomenal. It's rated at plus or minus 15 seconds a month. And that's in comparison to what you get, for example, on an NH35, which that is a daily rate. But in reality, this watch is actually way more accurate. I've worn this continuously over a week or two back then when I first got it, and it was as good as zero, and the most it gained in that 2-week period was about a second. Now, the main thing why you'd obviously want a spring drive is for that smooth sweep, that glorious zero beat continuous sweep, which is a joy to look at each and every single time. And honestly, I've done that. Every time I look at the time or I look at the watch, I have to just wait for that 30-second or a minute minimum to see that whole sweep. It is something truly magnificent, especially if you're used to ticks and quartz. I mean, that does, I think, get everybody who looks at these Grand Seiko movements. Now, I can also give you a very technical explanation as to how and why they're able to do this, but you can find that information on Google. But to capture it in a nutshell, Seiko use a tri-synchro quartz regulator type thing to actually control and regulate the accuracy and the speed, giving it this unique continuous sweep. Now, the movement, I think, is on its own level with that. And also, being a dive watch fan, when it's encased in this MM600 shell, honestly, you do have a bit of a wild moment. It's like the first time seeing Goku hit Super Saiyan 3, or seeing the McLaren F1 GTR, or for the first time hearing that Ferrari F40. So, I mean, I've waffled on enough. Let's give you guys a rundown of the specifications and talk just about the watch now. So the watch has an air-coated sapphire crystal. You've got 600 meters of water resistance. It's a full titanium case and bracelet. You've got anti-magnetic resistance down to 60 gauge. You've got diashield coating applied to the watch case and the bracelet. You've got 120 click bezel. Now, I think the bezel material is enameled steel or lacquered steel. I was corrected by a viewer on the last video. It's the same as the MM300. And then finally, obviously, that 5R66 GMT spring drive movement. Dimensions wise, the MM600 is exactly 2 millimeters bigger than the MM300. You get a 46 millimeter case diameter. You've got an overall thickness of 17 millimeters, a lug to lug of 52 millimeters, and a 21 millimeter lug width. Now, most people will say instantly after hearing those dimensions, what the actual hell, that's absolutely huge. But listen guys, it wears really well. On my 6.5-inch wrist, obviously it sits a little high and it's a little big. And when you wear it, it's like you're wearing some military hardware, but it looks good. It looks awesome on wrist. The lug nuts, that bezel, that bracelet, the whole watch case, everything else looks so badass around it. And it's actually lighter than the MM300 on bracelet due to that titanium used. Now, the only thing I'd say is don't wear it when you're in a t-shirt. If you've got small wrist, then you'd probably look like a Power Ranger. But so what? The watch has lug nuts, as I said. And that's the first feature we're going to talk about. I don't know how people can hate these lug nuts. It's the thing that makes you like this. From far, it just looks like a beefier MM300, but with these hex bolts, they make this watch look like a transformer or something, and it definitely adds to that tool, that utilitarian watch aesthetic. And in my opinion, this is what makes the MM600 combined with that bezel, of course. The hex nuts themselves are mirror polished. You've got them sitting flush against those lugs, and a very small, refined, polished divot just at the bottom, and it has functional reason to be there. You unscrew, remove the bezel and clean once you've been building sandcastles along the ocean floor. Then you get that bezel, a sawtooth design. It's not overly excessive or exaggerated, it's just enough to make it stand out and give it that killer look. It's also fully polished and you get ample grip and it looks and feels great. Now let's check the rotation. Now this one does vary a little. So the rotation is very smooth, but this particular one, you can probably hear, is not as consistent for me. I much prefer the mechanical gliding sound of the MM300. That sound is all the way consistent. Now maybe this needs a bit of oiling or whatever on the gasket, but it still delivers that mechanical gliding sound. It is very Seiko-esque. And yes, it does line up to the 12, but in my opinion, that could be better. But they all do vary. There's no consistency across the board. And that is the issue that Seiko has down to, the lower end levels. Now let's take a look at the dial. It's almost as deep as the water resistance. You've got jet black matte dial featuring an applied brushed logo, and you get absolute minimal glare and reflection on the dial. Now the markers also appear to be stamped or pressed from the back of the dial. And the same goes for that raised edge around that date. Here the date disc is white, but I much prefer the silvery metal disc from the MM300. On this dial, you also get 3 lines of crisp white text. It's not as much as the MM300, so it doesn't look busy at all. And you also get a very steep slope chaptering with the 24-hour markings and the minute markers. Now this also adds to that insane depth perception you get on the dial. Now let's talk power reserve. I don't actually fully understand why you would put one on the dial of an automatic watch. Like why? I've even debated this with my friend and I still don't like the idea. Now I have seen certain Grand Seikos, they have it on the back, particularly the hand wound versions, which makes complete sense. But for an automatic, I don't get it. And for me, it has ruined many Grand Seiko dials. But with this, it does kind of make sense as this is the most tooliest tool watch, right? And we also get this next level of finishing even on the indicator. You've got a polished hand with a top cap, and you've got a highly polished indicator itself. Now that's absolute premium finishing right there. Now you're moving on to the main hand stack. I am gutted they weren't the MM300 or even the cathedralized MM300 hands. Something just a little bit more aggressive, but these do actually work. You'll notice that they are matte silver. The focus here on this watch and the dial is to minimize reflections on the dial. In fact, the only bit of reflection you get is from that slim polished seconds hand and perhaps that power reserve. And you also have that white sword-like GMT hand, which when you're not actually paying attention to it, it is in the background. And the pros for this watch definitely outweigh my preferences, which would be not to have a GMT hand. Now this then brings me on to the movement function. Being a true GMT, and by far the most annoying thing about this is the date setting. It isn't a quick set. You literally have to cycle to the date using the hour hand. Yes, the hour hand clicks back and forward, which does speed it up, but you've got to keep in mind what cycle you're on. Is it the 12 hour or the 24 hour? So you can set it and the date changes at the correct time. Now that's the only thing which bothers me about it, but winding it or watching that indicator fill up, or in Seiko's case, fill down, again, something which does bring a smile to your face. Now just a little point on the crown. This is quite a lot better than the MM300 in terms of smoothness, but it doesn't pop like most. When you unscrew it, it's ready to engage and to be wound. Now visually, this one carries the Prospex logo, but the generation one, the SBDB001, features an S crown with the S that is embossed into the crown. And I'm not seeing that many S crowns. Now, I would have much preferred if they used the S crown over the Prospex on this one, but I get it, this is the newer version, and they're going with that universal sort of Prospex branding. So the last bit left on the dial is the lume. Now, do I really need to show you? You've got absolute thermonuclear lume for sure. Anything which glows in the day, you know it's super lume at night. Now it looks even cooler because of how deep it is on the watch face, and it's all you could ask for, to be honest. And notice how the GMT hand isn't lumed, so it's not in the way, which keeps it a three-hander at night time. Now when we check out the case, you will never see a titanium case finished this well. I don't know how they can get that level of mirror polishing and brushing on the titanium. I do think it's a type of titanium alloy, so maybe it has got a bit more steel in there or whatever. And yes, it is Zaratsu polished. The transitions are perfectly crisp. There's no stray lines, no blurry lines. You've got just absolute crisp, precise perfection. And they've also kept that middle band where the brushing goes across the center of the case. And this is just one thing which I do love about the MM600 case overall, is that how closely this is still related to the MM300. It's not a totally different watch. It's like Seiko took the MM300, put it on steroids and gave it some armor. And just again, going over the finishing, as I said, for a big tool watch, this level of crispness is literally rarely seen. And the fact that Seiko have done such an amazing job, made it look so high end, and yet it still stands out like a bit of a bruiser. Now moving on to the case back, it is solid titanium. It's got all the specifications you expect to see. You also got the pattern in the center. The only thing I can say there is that to touch, the pattern is not fully refined. You do get a slight bit of roughness. Nothing that affects you or you can feel on wrist, but it's just a point worth mentioning. So let's check out that bracelet on this. So straight away, it is much better than the MM300, miles in fact. You've got a more proportionate links. There still are all H-link design with two segments at the top and bottom. You also have wider polished bands on either side of the center links, and it is a perfect match and it's very uniform from the end link where you've got your hex nut. Now, I mean, just look at the hex nut once again. You've got a mirror polished frame highlighting the importance of this nut, giving it its own platform for maintenance. Now this is carried down to the bottom of the bracelet. Now the bracelet is completed with that legendary ratchet clasp. Now pay attention to how proportionate the clasp actually is. It's not a very long clasp. We actually see longer on the fly adjustable clasps. So this is quite short. It does blend into the bracelet, but also features that hidden mechanism. And it is absolute pure genius. It's the same thing as the MM300. Every time you put this watch on, you get to do the final few clicks to set the watch to your wrist, and it's always an event. Then another point I want to mention is on this clasp. As I mentioned, the MM300, I did upgrade mine to give it that polished bevels. I think those clasps are from the newer SNR or LX series of Marine Masters, but this one again just looks a bit dated when you do compare it to the upgraded clasp upon the MM300, and the polish levels should definitely have been present on this one. Now moving on to pricing, this watch is around the 2K mark, give or take a couple of hundred. I paid a little bit more for mine, but given the condition and the fact that every single tag was present and intact, I'd say it was definitely worth it. The only scratches on this watch are the ones that I've put on there. Now again, I am a true value for money guy, and I couldn't justify spending over 2K on a Tudor or something similar, maybe an Oris. I even looked at the Pelagos 39, but in comparison to this, those are basic, extremely basic. And it goes to what I said in the MM300 video. When we go back to the 90s and the early 2000s, Seiko were on fire with what they were giving us. This watch was released in 2005 and it's now 2025, and it can still annihilate the majority of the competition. Now the only thing is size. That's the only part that's a bit worrying. I know actually it is technically a little big for me, but I would take it over this watch. So what if I look like a Power Ranger in a t-shirt? But realistically, if you have the wrist of 7 inches or above, then you can definitely wear it. Now these watches are kind of hard to find, but there still are examples. I did put one up on my community page. It was less than £2,000, so definitely worth considering. So right, that is enough from me. Thank you all for sitting through this one. I'm going to do yet another video where I compare the MM200 versus the MM300 and obviously versus the MM600. So make sure you do subscribe. Now let me know your thoughts below, guys, and I'll see you on the next video. Thank you all for watching.